When I was in the seminary, a good number of my courses ended with oral exams, a 10-minute one-on-one sit-down with the professor, during which he would ask about a little bit of anything or everything from the 4 months or so of lectures that had just been completed. Obviously, you can't fit a whole semester into that time frame, but you get a few questions here or there. And so some of these exams went better than others, as you might imagine. I remember particularly the exam at the end of my canon law course about 2 years prior to my ordination. Most of the questions focused on the church's organizational structure. And at one point, the professor asked me about consecrated life. I responded by talking about communities of religious brothers or sisters and their essential vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. I spoke about the idea of charisms, or particular gifts, that each such community is called to have. As I spoke, the professor nodded along, which I took as a good sign. He then asked me, "Is it essential in the life of the church that we have such consecrated men and women who have professed these vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience?" I paused a second and I said, "Well, no, I suppose not absolutely essential. It's a good thing, very helpful in the life of the church, but not absolutely essential." The professor, who was a 60 or so year old Italian Jesuit, looked back at me and said, "So, the church's essential parts would be the lay faithful and the ordained ministers only. Is that what you're saying?" Now, by this point, I was not completely sure I had chosen the right track of an answer. But I thought it was too late to change, so I said, "Well, yeah, that's it." His response then was, "Do you think the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, agrees with you in his apostolic exhortation on consecrated life?" No. By that point, I realized there was no way to salvage this line of thinking anymore. The professor went on to explain that having persons whose lives are consecrated to Christ in such a close imitation of Jesus must always be present in the church. This type of self-surrender reflects the life that Jesus himself chose, and thus makes that life present among us as well. Besides the more familiar communities of brothers and sisters who are the most sort of abundant example of consecrated life in this way, this idea of having persons whose lives and whose dedication to Jesus serves as an example and a reminder for us all, that idea also helps to explain the church's practice of consecrating virgins living in the world, as happened yesterday for one of our own parishioners, Mary Kelly. You might have seen the information in the bulletin over the last few weeks about Mary's consecration. If you're wondering why you've never heard of a consecrated virgin before, well, it's not an extremely common thing in modern times. It existed in the ancient church and was revived again after the Second Vatican Council, which is actually similar to what happened with permanent deacons. We had permanent deacons in the early church, then we didn't for centuries, and then they were brought back with Vatican II. Well, similarly with consecrated virgins, and there are now about 4,000 consecrated virgins worldwide, around 250 here in the United States. A consecrated virgin is mystically betrothed to Christ and dedicated to service in the church. She wears a ring to mark this state, but she does not wear a habit or use the title sister. She lives her life individually, not as part of any sort of convent or larger religious community. She commits to praying morning prayer and evening prayer every day, but is not bound to any particular service or spirituality, even as she is encouraged, yes, to be a woman of prayer and of service. And of course, as the vocation's name implies, her life is a life of perpetual virginity. Now, you might hear all that and say, well, that's nice, but you might even have that similar line of thinking to what I was thinking going into that exam in the seminary. Is it really necessary, though? What purpose does it serve the rest of us to have these 4,000 or so women worldwide as consecrated virgins? Well, if that's the question in your mind, it's worth remembering that all of us are called to imitate Jesus in our daily lives. For many of us, that means imitating him through Christ-like self-giving in our family relationships. And for all of us, it means exercising Christ-like love for God and our neighbor. We can know in our hearts that we need to imitate the self-giving, fully dedicated love of Jesus. But even when we know that, we need living reminders also to encourage us. We need prophets, similar to what we heard about in our readings today. In our first reading, the Lord sends Amos to prophesy to rebellious Israelites with the declaration, "And whether they heed or resist, they shall know that a prophet has been among them." The Lord knows that Amos might not convince the Israelites right away, but if they at least know that a prophet has been among them, then something might begin to work on their consciences to change their actions further down the road. In our gospel reading, Jesus encounters the resistance of being dismissed by people who won't believe him because they know him and they know his background. Jesus simply remarks afterward, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own native place and among his own kin and in his own house." If people had such a hard time listening to prophets in Amos's time and in Jesus' time, perhaps we also will have a hard time listening to them in our time as well. And so perhaps we need a variety of different prophets in our world. Through her consecration, which took place yesterday at the Cathedral of St. Andrew in Little Rock, Mary Kelly's life now points to the next life, reminding us, as Jesus said, that they neither marry nor are given in marriage in heaven. In that way, her state in life takes on a prophetic dimension, reminding us that we are called to follow Christ completely, to imitate him in our lives, and to look forward to the life to come. And because we are so stubborn as human beings, that prophetic reminder is not just good or nice, but is absolutely essential for all of us.